Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Stuart Smith, National Party MP, Chair Finance and Expenditure Committee, Select Committee. Also Select Committee members Chloe Swarbrick, Green Party co-leader Megan Woods, Labour Party MP, former Energy Minister of course, and also member of the committee. Please welcome them. And the questions app is in action, so make good use of it. An important caveat is that the committee is yet to report back to Parliament on its inquiry, and under parliamentary protocol, of course, they're not in a position to detail what they may or may have determined on specific measures or recommendations. They can speak generally about what they're endeavouring in this process and to what they're hearing about the key issues in their inquiry. The panel will take your questions, as we said, so send them in. Stuart, can you start with that? What are you endeavouring to do here on a cross-party basis?
Oh, thank you very much. Ultimately, we want an inquiry report that informs legislation that will have an enduring response, as you said, to adaptation, and that would look like a framework around whether decisions are made, let's say, for example, about retreat, who makes those decisions, and who pays ultimately, and that is one aspect of it. There's a whole raft of other issues, and actually it was pretty well covered by the submissions that we had. So there will be legislation introduced at some point. Unfortunately, we discussed this earlier, but I can't say when that's going to be, because ultimately we haven't got the report yet. Once the report is completed, then they'll set about, the officials will set about, and the Minister going through what they want to have in legislation. So that'll be a process. Whether it'll be more likely more than one piece of legislation, but I wouldn't expect any legislation this year, and it'll be an initial platform from which it will continue to evolve. So it's important that the reason that actually it's a bipartisan approach is because we want this to endure. So we want to ultimately meet with something that we can pretty much all agree with, and then that'll evolve over time from there.
So there might be one primary adaptation act that comes out sometime next year, but then could people anticipate further supplementary legislation, regulation over time? What sort of time frame are we talking about?
Well, we don't know until we get the report, and that'll be a start, but I would imagine it'll be one initial piece of legislation. Let's call it, say, a climate adaptation bill. I don't know what it'll be called, but let's say it is. And then I would imagine, depending on what we are going to do, there'll be a lot of acts that would have to be amended in some way. For example, the issue with the Wairau Bar, at least I've got the Wairau in my electorate, it's in my brain, and the inability to get it opened and prior to a flood. That would be resource management legislation and on the Local Government Act perhaps even, and that would need to be dealt with. And I think that's a practical thing that we can do. Ultimately, we've built all of our towns and cities on floodplains, essentially, or a lot of them, or part of, and we've highly modified our rivers, and therefore we've created a big problem.
I'll bring each of you in on what to expect and what not to expect out of this, but let's just keep going with this at the moment. So in terms of how legislation interfaces with each other, this wouldn't be play second fiddle to whatever replaces the RMA. They would have to accord with each other?
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, do each of you want to speak to expectations and time frame out of what might come out of this? Chloe, Megan?
So
no, you go.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, look, obviously there is only so much that can be said, and there is a lot of information that's currently being considered in kind of privileged discussion, parliamentary privilege. But I guess just to be really forthright and actually to echo the same things that I said in the notice of motion that we debated in Parliament prior to it getting to Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, this will be a colossal waste of time if we do not agree on some of the fundamental things that actually need to be put into that legislation. We have had a number of inquiries and partial inquiries from the likes of the Environment Select Committee. Māori Affairs also considered some of this stuff. And I think that if you are to reflect on some of what is already in the public arena, from that which has been put on the table by submitters, and if you look at some of the questions that have been asked by parliamentarians, you can get a pretty clear sense of where some of those gnarly issues are. So the allocative model, for example, which Stuart was alluding to in terms of who pays, I think also the role of local government, and just to be completely straight up from kind of where we're coming at that, where we're coming to as the Greens, is that it is rather concerning that we are having this conversation in the backdrop and the context of some of what I would perceive as some punching down on local government, when we already have a number of inquiries and reports which showcase that we are an outlier internationally for the proportion of resource that's assigned to local government. There also needs to be, some proper and thorough consideration and integration of the likes of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and that was put really soundly on the record by a number of submitters, but also by local government, who spoke extensively to how they're already doing this stuff on the ground. And I think that we can also learn a lot of lessons from some of the amazing projects that I've had the privilege of engaging with on the ground, the likes of the South Dunedin Futures program, where we are seeing this stuff already happening. So how do we meaningfully resource empower it and give it that legislative backing?
I'm going to come back with some obvious questions on that. But Megan, what to expect? What will people get? What will they not get at the end of this?
Well, I think one of the things, this has been a relatively short select committee inquiry. I think it's worth noting. It's been a period of, I think submissions closed in July or August, and we're reporting back in the not too distance in the next few weeks. So I think that's really worth bearing in mind. Chloe alluded to it, that we are building on that work that the Environment Select Committee started, and particularly, and some people are probably in the room, the Technical Working Group report, or the Expert Working Group report that sat behind it, which is a really important piece of work.
It's the Terence Arnold Expert Group?
Yes.
Thank you.
And so some really, really detailed work that has gone into that. So I don't want anyone who's sitting in the room that's already put a lot of work into this to think that's all been thrown out. But we are attempting to do this in a multi-partisan way. I think it is absolutely critical that this goes to the heart of our political differences in so many ways, the question of adaptation, or it could, unless we had an agreed framework to try and figure out what we can agree on. This goes to property rights, this goes to individualism versus collectivism. It really does go to that heart of difference, and the way in which we have that relationship with Te Ao Māori as well is absolutely critical, as Chloe alluded to. But everybody on that committee has a commitment, because we have to. We cannot have waxing and waning between governments around what the principles are. People need that certainty, and we're all keenly aware of that.
Should we say, though, that people should not expect anything approximating a draft bill out of this? Is this going to be quite high level, including in part because of some of those differences?
It was never our mandate to come out with a draft bill.
Okay. Can we talk about some of the questions that are obvious and gnarly and are already being explored, and get a sense of at least what you're hearing, right? Who pays for climate-related losses, both public and private? What are you hearing about
the
options?
$64 billion question, isn't it? Yeah. Who pays for what? And that is what sits at the heart of all of this. And that's, Chloe talked about it, one of the things that I think people can expect to see in the report, and we've heard from a number of submitters around, is what is the framework for that allocative model. At one end sits that the individual accepts all the loss. At the other end is that the Crown bears all the costs of it. Now, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and I think that people can see that both those extremes are probably not somewhere where we as a country want to land. I think most of us would like some schools and some hospitals and things at some point as well. So how is it that we can get that framework, particularly with local government, but also with insurance? Because I think one of the things that will come to bear very much, if we're talking about reactive or proactive retreat, if we get into that, it's about whether or not we're responding to insurable events or we're trying to get ahead of them. So there are a number of really, really thorny issues that sit at the heart of it.
Why don't we start with proactive retreat then as a discussion point? What are the options here? The obvious one is who decides. Is this community-led with the assistance of scientists, for example, but with some national standards modelling, threshold to guide? Stuart, I beg your pardon. Yeah.
That is the difficult question, but I think we should go back a step, and the first thing I'd like to do is ensure people aren't building in places that are flood prone now, and we can actually do something about that, and quite quickly, I believe. But at the moment, it's not. Councils get the blame for it, but actually, you can't blame a council for not fighting a developer if they're a small council and then looking at a very expensive court case. So we need to ensure that is stopped.
So could that be like an MPS, again, without indicating anything? Because right now you've had 1,400, on the anniversary of the anniversary weekend floods, 1,400 new homes consented. So that could happen in advance even of legislation, potentially?
Well, I would think so, but that's not for us to decide. What we're going to do is give recommendations about what should be done. The how is for the officials to come up with. But I think I see Bryce sitting in the front here. A lot of people have the view that insurance companies are going to take care of all this. And that's not right. And they play a part. They price risk. That's fair. But ultimately, we have to make a decision about who and where people will have to retreat from, rather than waiting for insurance companies to say we're not going to insure you anymore. We'd be failing in our job if we don't find a framework to ensure that is done in a fair way.
So the Terence Arnold chaired report that you were talking about, the expert report, talked about several things. For a start, hardship being a basis. The landlord might be compensated, the homeowner might be compensated, the business might be compensated, but maybe not the family batch, for example. But also, pre-funding was on his mind, with the likes of a potential levy and so forth. Is that what you are hearing from others saying? If we're going to do proactive retreat, we need to think about building up funds?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard very clearly from a number of local authorities who have submitted that they don't want any more mandate or responsibility without the resources to meaningfully fulfil on that. So I think that's pretty crystal clear as to how we build up those resources. Unfortunately, again, potentially privileged. I think just to reflect on some of the other points that have been made around who pays and at what point, there is actually something to address here in terms of the asymmetry of access to information as well, and something which I've been hearing about and I'm getting quite concerned about, especially with some of the loss of our climate scientists working for the public sector, is that my understanding is some of that gap is starting to be filled by private companies who are doing this modelling, and that in turn means that people are going to have to purchase that modelling data, and it doesn't necessarily come with a uniformity to the data sets that are around the rest of the country. And what that means is that who gets access to that data is going to depend on their capacity to pay. So again, this is where it's really critical that not only are we thinking about the legislative instruments here to open up and say where the liability falls and who pays, etc., but also the level of information that people are being given in order to to make these decisions effectively. And I think that this prompts another interesting point that I was discussing when I was in Dunedin with the South Dunedin Futures team, who are amazing. If you ever have any time to sit down and talk to that collaboration, I'd highly recommend it. They've been underway with a 5-year process to effectively do all of this consultation with the community, and again, without any real meaningful, there has been some government grants, or otherwise we're not going to get into that now, but what they are now starting to look at doing, because they're going to have to, is provide the information about effectively where there are these real major risks. And that is going to have huge downstream potential impacts if we don't have this legislative framework in place for people's properties, whether they're insurable anymore or otherwise. So this is why we need this universal framework from government.
So this comes us to the idea that has already been previously discussed by others about some kind of community-led proactive retreat, but needing local government, needing central government support, both with the quality of data, perhaps some consistent standards of threshold over what might trigger what decision, the next decision.
But Stuart was also just arguing for local government to have real mandate and power and authority to say where people can't build. That's quite a difference of where things currently sit, and I think that that's a really important point.
I think, and the expert working group report covers this off really well in terms of the triggers and how it is that you do have have those decision makers. I've lived in a community, I'm from Christchurch, where managed retreat was pretty much a given in some areas in terms of the residential red zone after the earthquakes. It wasn't mandatory, it was voluntary offers that were put to people, but it became pretty clear that it wasn't going to be tenable to continue to live in those areas. I think we've got some examples now where we can look around the countries, some examples in the Hutt, in Waitakere, in some places where in much smaller scales, we're talking kind of 10s and 20s of houses rather than thousands that we saw in the residential red zone. But actually I think there's some fundamentals that need to be there, that anywhere that has attempted this and done it with community buy-in hasn't resorted to the Public Works Act as their first instrument in order to do it, that there are community-led discussions that need to be had. And I think that we need to look really carefully as we're putting together our report, a lot of those recommendations around how you do that community engagement from the expert working group.
But you're not going to get agreement.
Of course you're not.
And so is
but that's why you need a framework.
Could that framework go so far as to say, if this threshold is reached, then this happens. If this threshold is reached, then this happens.
And that's the point that the report makes, the expert working group report makes about having those triggers, thresholds. People need to have some predictability and some certainty. And I think there's some of the critical things as we go through this. There's some other really good recommendations in there that draw really heavily on the Christchurch experience about having access to support for people to guide them through it. So a national advisory service, we set it up for people with their insurance claims post-quake in Christchurch, but actually having that port of call where people can get expert and technical advice to talk them through these decisions, I think is something that we've learned a great deal about.
So again, there'll be public funding in some form. There will be insurance funding potentially in some form, especially after an event. But what of the concept of pre-funding? The Arnold report talked about a levy on households, for example. Is it a live discussion you're hearing?
We've certainly discussed it in the committee. So how far we're going to go on that is yet to be seen. But everything is on the table at this stage for discussion. Whether it ends up in the report's another matter. But, ultimately, not only are the models here in New Zealand, but there's also models for retreat in Australia, which have been done quite successfully. There's different models there, different methods of payment and who paid. And I think that if we'd be foolish not to learn from that experience. But ultimately, we have time to develop this so we can... we've got some initial cases that, like Westport and South Dunedin, that are real and present, but there are other places that will be real and present in the future. And so if we get a good framework to work from, that can be developed further over time, and that's what we would ultimately like in the legislation is something that we can build on. And
over what time frame?
Reform.
There's people in this room doing their climate-related disclosures and finding that challenging. And if, you happen to own an airport or a key distribution, area or whatever, what sort of time frame to resolve the big assets and the who pays for the sometimes part-owned public, part-owned private assets?
I'll leave the time frame to Stuart. He'll be in a much better position to give us that information. But I think one of the things that a lot of our conversations do tend to concentrate on residential households when we talk about managed retreat, and we do talk about adaptation. But I think it's worth bearing in mind those initial Treasury reports that came out post the North Island weather events, only a quarter of the costs were actually in residential dwellings. The rest was in infrastructure and businesses. So I think you make a really good point about the fact that we have to think about this far more broadly than residential homes. Incredibly important issue for us to grapple with, but it is broad. But I'll leave you to comment on the time frame, Stuart.
Again, I say that the first thing to do is to ensure that if you're in an area that's at risk, you are aware of that before you invest more into those assets. if they are going to
Could
be
name
at
you
some
a couple
point.
of airports that are likely at risk straight off the bat.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So how long...
Including Niwa's building, I believe. It's pretty close to sea level.
Including how... So what sort of time frame on these big assets, which will have big dollars and cents attached and decisions to be made about either resilience or retreat, what sort of time frame might unfold out of this first legislation and what follows?
Well, I can't give you one at this time.
But likely years still to resolve some of these.
Oh, well, I would think so.
Yeah. Okay. Some of the questions coming in. How would Mr Smith reconcile the Prime Minister's remarks to local government about having to, quote, rein in the fantasies, unquote, with the work they're doing, the lion's share of the work to help communities with adaptation planning?
Oh, I think we're talking about different things there, and ultimately, as I said earlier, with the which Chloe alluded to, with the legislation or some framework where councils can stop people building in a place that's flood prone, is a sensible thing and that shouldn't be does not in any way connected to what the Prime Minister said. And I think what the Prime Minister said is quite right. And actually, I note that a lot of councillors agree with that those points he was making. We're
trying to be multi-partisan here, Stuart.
We are ultimately looking at a long-term issue that is beginning in the near future, absolutely. But we haven't sorted what the framework would be. But either way, the same people pay. It's either taxpayers or ratepayers, and they're the same people.
And another question, how closely are you working with local government on the inquiry, given their key role in implementing adaptation? Just hearing submissions or having a deeper conversation?
Honestly, just hearing submissions. That is the honest truth of it. So, I mean, all of us are not precluded from going out and engaging directly with our local authorities or with some of those different kind of localised projects that some of us have alluded to. But I guess just to provide some further kind of context and background to my comments earlier, and I guess, part of what that question was prompting as well, is that we have a very bizarre kind of framework with regard to how local government and central government operate in this country. The last time that I checked the stats, and forgive me, it was back in 2016 when there was another local body election happening, was that in the OECD, the average amount of spending that occurred at a local government proportional to central government level was around 11%, and in the OECD, the average proportion was around 30%, so we're less than half of that international average. And then we've had, 15 years ago, the Shand inquiry, and then which Winston Peters helped to initiate, then a Productivity Commission review of the Shand inquiry 5-6 years ago, and then most recently last year we had the Future of Local Government review. All of those have told us, wait for it, local government does not have the resources to do what it is mandated to do. And that's why we continue to get stuck in this hyper-politicised merry-go-round in which it's quite easy for politicians from central government to punch down and say that local government is wasting its resources or otherwise, and levying from ratepayers, when in fact the solution has been put on the table by at least 3 reports which I've just noted, which say that central government needs to share its revenue if it wants local government to do this work in the first place. So I think that we need to be having far more grown-up and evidence-based discussions about how we do that resource and cost sharing.
This is about resilience too. This is right now about roading resilience, bridge resilience in parts of the country that sometimes have very small numbers of ratepayers. Will that be addressed?
Well, it's also about
possibly
urban design
in the report.
But it's also about urban design, and I mean, this wasn't intended to be a political gripe session, but we did have a framework where we knew the 3 pieces of legislation which were going to replace the RMA, right? The natural and built environments, the spatial planning, and then this climate adaptation piece. Now we've gone back to the drawing board because, as we've seen, the incentive structure inside of our current political climate and system is such that the baby tends to get thrown out with the bathwater with whomever tends to be in charge of government. And what we're trying to do with this climate adaptation inquiry is at least nail down some of the fundamental principles that all of us can agree upon.
Right.
But we are largely operating in a space where we don't actually know a lot of the stuff that the government is going to do. And we're also hearing soundings about, for example, reading between the lines, more urban sprawl. And we know that good climate adaptation is also mitigation. It doesn't take up our productive soil. It gives us more green infrastructure and green spaces. It looks like renewable energy investment, and that also fosters resilience.
Okay.
So just on that point though, Catherine, one of the things that I think that This is about resilience, so we need to be thinking about that in everything we're doing in terms of infrastructure investment. I think about the January floods in Auckland, that Northcote and Roskill escaped flooding that they would have had otherwise, and that was largely down to the large-scale urban development work that Kāinga Ora was doing for intensification.
Like opening waterways, that
absolutely,
kind of thing. Yeah.
And it's that green infrastructure. And if we look at that example that I talked about in Waitakere, that was actually about buying houses that were flood-prone and actually turning them back into green infrastructure.
So
and
that was a
that
government
land.
agency.
That was a government agency.
Right.
Well, no, with Auckland Council, I believe. I'd have
pardon.
to go back and do that. But one of the things that we do have to make sure that we're not over-investing in resilience and literally fighting against the tide. We can't just say we can engineer our way out of all of this. We are going to have to look at what are the things we're going to have to do differently, because we have to make sure, as Chloe said, one of the things that I'm adamant about with this is that adaptation just doesn't become an excuse for us to keep emitting as much as we want. We cannot take our eye off what we need to do in climate mitigation as well. Okay. And so we've got to make sure we're doing all those things together.
Stuart Smith, I'll put this one to you. We already know there are extremely vulnerable communities out there, says this questioner. They can't afford council rate increases, insurance premiums, or to relocate. Funding such a key question here. Do you foresee bespoke solutions depending on community?
Yes, I think absolutely. One size won't fit all. They'll all have their own unique nuances that will need to be either financing in some way, and also whether you're going to retreat or not.
See, this is what I'm trying to get at, because we know from numerous places around the country when you try and even put something on a LIM report, there's a court case. So is what we're theoretically talking about something that will have national consistency and clear thresholds?
Oh, it has to have national consistency, but obviously Westport and South Dunedin have a similar issue, but they're quite different. And so there'll be other places around New Zealand that will also face those issues. So, one size won't fit all in terms of retreat or trying to hold back the tide, as Megan said. Sometimes that will be the right decision, but the cases that we're thinking about, that probably isn't the solution.
So, Catherine, one of the things that has struck me that's come through consistently and strongly from submissions is that data piece. And it's about whether or not there is something like a national database, rather than asking individual councils in some ways to go and do battle with their communities over their limbs. So I think it's about, if we go back and think about it, it's about access to information. How do we deliver that is an entirely different question, and we don't have to always go to the LIM as the way in which that information can be communicated.
Is that information known now, held by central government agency or agencies?
Probably banks and insurance companies have a whole lot more of that information.
Well, is that going to become potentially useful information?
Yes.
And
yes.
how might that be developed?
But it's there now. It's just whether people know how to look for it.
Well, might it be made easier for them to look for it in a consistent and credible database?
That is actually one of the things that we've heard from a lot of submitters, is that there needs to be some form of agency for people to engage with, to get user experience friendly information so that they can make informed decisions.
Updated.
Yeah, updated. But again, that it needs to be readily available and accessible to all as a matter of public good, not something that people need to purchase and that looks different in different areas of the country.
Okay. Are conversations happening with interested parties who might be able to contribute to such a database?
We have heard from some of the interested parties in the course of our submissions, but I think, Catherine, that a lot of this will actually be, this is a select committee inquiry report. A lot of that will then need to be picked up by the government. So when Stuart says that the officials will go away and do things, I hope ministers are keenly involved in that as well and are talking to interested parties, and that I think is when a lot of that will happen. We will make recommendations. I think it's really important to remember that this is a select committee inquiry. It's not coming up with the finished product.
This questioner, great to hear about the strong bipartisan focus on adaptation. Why can't we take this approach to other domains like climate mitigation or infrastructure? I mean, is there any prospect of it?
Look, I want to be real, if I can just be really straight up for a second. You have 3 of the 5 parties that are in Finance and Expenditure Committee currently represented, and we're not talking about bipartisanship of 2 political parties, we're talking about an attempt at cross-partisanship. But we also need to note that kind of the infrastructural framework for climate mitigation in this country in the form of the Zero Carbon Act was voted against by one of the current coalition parties. And if you can read between the lines in some of the issues that I was putting forward, as have been in public submissions, there are some really gnarly live political issues that we have to work through right now, which submitters are telling us they want reflected in this framework for climate adaptation. And there's only, unfortunately, given the privileged conversations that we're having behind the scenes, that I can say there. But I think, unfortunately, as I was alluding to before, the incentives, if you were to design a system that was capable, let alone competent, of dealing with the issues of our time, you would not design the Westminster colonial parliamentary system. Okay? There's that as a starting point. And then if we do manage to find this brave new hope off the back of nailing down at least what we can move forward with together in terms of this climate adaptation framework, then yes, hopefully we get it in the climate mitigation framework. But yeah, I think that the basic problem continues to be how we conceive of economics, and how politicians, when they stand up and talk to you about the economy, we're all probably talking about radically different things.
Just got one small comment. I completely agree, and I think one of the things that people need to understand is that multi-partisanship cannot be about everybody watering down the values they bring to this conversation to nothing. Of course, there's red lines that need to be there in terms of for us as Labour to put our name on it and to say that we have agreed this. There's some things we couldn't agree to, and so I think that people need to realise multi-partisanship is hard. It's really done in this country. We do need to do it more. I think the fact that we did have the Zero Carbon Act is something that was hard for probably by a lot of people in this room, and we do need to carry that through into mitigation as well. But it can't just become so anemic and banal that it's meaningless, if that's what it becomes.
There's a good question here then. Stuart, I'll put this to you, does attempting cross-party collaboration that everyone agrees with mean by definition it ends up being a benign, unambitious scheme?
I've got a bit more faith than that. I'd have to say, when you cross the side of the House, when you after an election, it does change your perspective, and it's completely different, as Megan will well know, and ultimately it is where you're sitting on which side of the House as to what your attitude's going to be. But we didn't embark on this cross-party attempt at a good report that we can all agree with without intending to try and get a good result out of it. And that goes for all of the parties around the table. They have all tried their best, I think, so far, and I think we're going along pretty well. Ultimately, we're about to get to the pointy end, though. And Megan's right, there will be red lines, and there has to be. But we are determined to get something that will endure. Does that mean it would be as far as some would like? Probably not, but it might be further than some would like as well. So, and that's ultimately, you have to remember that politics is the art of the possible.
Yeah, so is trying to get 2 questions into 3 minutes 57 with 3 politicians, but we're going to try. Here we go. What do panellists consider is the role of the private sector in adaptation and climate resilience? It's a big question, but just bullet point where I think the question is coming from.
Look, honestly, don't leave politics to the politicians. Please, for the love of God, as you are hopefully hearing between the lines here, this is going to be incredibly difficult for us to get to any form of what could be construed as ambitious consensus unless politicians are hearing that potentially their jobs are on the line on this stuff. So I think one of the most important things that you can do is to put your heart on your sleeve, declare your values and be really straight up with the government, especially using the clout of being in the business sector, that you want the government to listen to you, given that that's the way that the government's holding itself out.
Okay. I would say to any business, when you're considering an investment, take the long-term view rather than the shorter, maybe cheaper view, because you might end up making a decision that will cost you more in the long run.
Conscious of time here, can I sneak this one in, Megan? Would you mind? Iwi Māori are disproportionately affected by climate impacts. Orapa, Wahitapu and Papakāinga bring unique context to the idea of retreat. How is the inquiry engaging with this?
That's been a really important aspect of the engagement that we've had. Not only are iwi Māori affected by climate change, but also a lot of the solutions lie in kaupapa Māori solutions and understanding the environment and how we approach what we do. So for us, one of those red lines is making sure that we are engaging in a strong partnership with te ao Māori as we go through, that Māori absolutely need to be at the table in what any solution around this looks like.
Okay. One more I'm going to sneak in. It's a little bit of a cheeky question, but it's also the ultimate question. What is the plan when insurance withdraws?
Probably looks different depending on which party you're asking, but it also probably depends on how long it takes for us to get to this point of, at the very least, instigating the starting point in which we're then going to be making decisions from, right? So, yeah, I mean, how long is a piece of string? There's so many other variables to fall in line there. But this is kind of... Sorry, I could go on forever about this, but in a nutshell, at the end of the day, we're talking about the legislative kind of structural framework that we're going to put in place here. That will be informed by our culture as a society, and here I'm talking about culture as not synonymous with people's ethnic or geographical or religious backgrounds or practices, but a shared set of values. When you think of society as a group of people from all those diverse backgrounds who come together because we share and prioritise certain values, that creates the environment conducive to legitimising that structure. So what I guess I'm asking for, if I can put anything on the table for the audience here, is to not let the government and to not let politicians and Parliament forget our country's values when considering and contemplating this framework.
Insurance companies price risk, and they're very good at it, and they will, you'll be getting price signals in your insurance bills. I think so. I personally believe unless something really dramatic happens, you'll get a lot of warning through the cost of your insurance.
I think that may have been a plea for some answers before that happens, increasingly happens.
Absolutely, and that's why this report cannot just be banal blancmange, but one of the critical things is that we've got to make sure we've got that planning framework so people can't keep building in places where they will be at risk, and why we do have to grapple with the idea of proactive retreat as well, and not just think that it's going to magically happen.
If you can't get unanimity, if there are, I've forgotten, it's been too long since I've been in Parliament, but if there are those who file reports from within the committee, what's the phrase?
Differing views, no longer minority reports.
Oh, really?
I know, who's going to make a movie called A Differing View? It's like...
Would you view that as failure?
We certainly would. I'd be very disappointed if we can't.
I'd be disappointed as well, and I think it's going to take all of us to give. This isn't about the opposition agreeing with the government. This is about us finding a space where all the parties can agree for the long term.
Yeah. And I guess I'd just say, like, reflecting on that point that Stuart made before, which I wrote down about how crossing the floor changes your perspective, maybe this is the privilege of being in an ostensibly smaller or minor party, but the facts don't change, depending on where you're sitting in the House. So I actually think that our obligation here is to the evidence and to our communities, not to partisanship. And if it ends up being that we are dealing with some entities or people within Parliament who are not willing to grapple with the reality of those facts, so be it. I would argue that that's the point. Sure, we should absolutely aim for consensus, but if the cost of aiming for that is not moving forward with a framework which is important for our communities, then those people will and can be left behind.
This month or next month for completing your report, for reporting to Parliament?
Next month.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, please.
Thank you.